The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is an amazing open world game. It did so many things right, both as an open world title and an evolution of the Zelda series. This was truly one of the first games that I played where if you can see it, you can go there, with very few exceptions. And it is also one of the first games in which an open world felt like what it was advertised as, where you can go anywhere you want at any time you wanted. It was advertised to be so open that Nintendo even coined the term open air. Because before then, most open world games I played restricted you in certain parts of the game, or the game was story driven with its world, in which you can only get to fully truly explore it when the game allows it or when you finish the main campaign. The reason I'm saying that Breath of the Wild is one of the first true open world games I've played is because I did play one before it. That game was Xenoblade Chronicles X. This game truly wowed me in many different ways, from the size of the map to being able to go anywhere at any time, and the fact that it runs almost flawlessly on the Wii U. Like, how did they pull this off? Sorry, lost myself a little bit there. Back to Breath of the Wild. This game is a masterpiece, but there are some things in the game that aren't handled as greatly as it could have been. One of those things I will be talking about today is the story structure of Breath of the Wild and how it could be improved in The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. The main point of this topic is to talk about how the story could be told in Tears of the Kingdom and how it could have been improved from Breath of the Wild. Another topic that I will talk about here that I plan to do for another episode is restrictive freedom. The reason I'm bringing this topic into this episode is because many of these elements are connected and can be discussed together in surprisingly unexpected ways. And please keep in mind that not all these ideas are supposed to go together. These are separate ideas and suggestions for the upcoming game that I'd like to discuss. In Breath of the Wild, its story was told in the player's own path. For an open world game, it is absolutely impressive how they were able to tell its story with this level of freedom. Spoiler alert for Breath of the Wild. We start off in the Great Plateau, which is basically the game's tutorial and a mini version of Hyrule. I actually think the Great Plateau is actually when the story structure is at its strongest in Breath of the Wild. I'll go into more details explaining why later. The game starts with Link waking up in the Shrine of Resurrection. As Link wakes up, he hears a mysterious female voice. When Link leaves the Shrine of Resurrection, he meets an old man, who at first we don't know. He gives us a bit of information on the Temple of Time nearby. Afterwards, we go on moving in any direction we want because the game doesn't give us an objective yet. Until...
Link. Head for the point marked on the map in your Sheikah slate.
So then we head towards where the voice tells us to go. In doing so, we awaken mysterious towers both on the Great Plateau and all around Hyrule. Then, the mysterious voice tells Link that he's been asleep for 100 years, and that the beast surrounding Hyrule Castle will cause the end of the world if it is not defeated. We climb down the tower, and then the old man encounters us again, and then tells us that the beast surrounding Hyrule Castle is Calamity Ganon. We tell the old man that we want to make way for the castle. He then tells us to go to the shrines on the Great Plateau. After we do all that, the old man meets us one final time to tell us to meet him at the Temple of Time. I do want to say that the way he tells us to find him was one of the best puzzles of the game, and it felt like a traditional Zelda riddle. When we meet the old man at the Temple of Time, he revealed that he is the deceased king of Hyrule, King Rome Bosphoramus Hyrule. He also reveals that Zelda was the mysterious voice that we heard when Link woke up. And then he reveals what happened that led up to Link being in the Shrine of Resurrection. He died, and was placed there at Zelda's command. And she went to face Ganon alone and has been keeping him at bay for the last 100 years. The king then says that it would be reckless to go to the castle right away, which you can do, and should instead head to Kakariko Village to talk to Impa. He tells you how to get there too. He then gives you the paraglider, which is basically the game's way of saying that the rest of the game's world is unlocked. Once that happens, the story structure isn't as strong. Now don't get me wrong, it's still a great one, but it peaked at the Great Plateau. So once you leave the Great Plateau, you can go anywhere you want at any time in the whole world of Hyrule. Let's say we heed the words of King Rome and head for Impa. Once we arrive there, Impa gives us the history of Calamity Ganon and tells us that the key to unlocking our memories is in the Sheikah Slate. It's locked away in a feature that the Sheikah Slate doesn't have anymore. So in order to fix that, we have to head for Hateno Village and meet with a scientist named Pura. She unlocks the camera in the Sheikah Slate as well as photos that were taken by Zelda herself. We arrive back to Impa, and then she tells us to go to a location from one of the photos. I think this is where the structure of the story is at its weakest. Now when I say weakest, I don't mean that it's weak in and of itself, I mean that it's weak compared to the other story structure elements of the game. It's still pretty strong. But the reason I say it's the weakest is because you can do these in any order. Now for an open world game, that sounds like a blessing. But for the story, it can go wrong. Because the problem with this system is that you can spoil big events from other memories that it can surprise you with. You can even get the final memory first. Here's an example of what a later memory can spoil. Zelda's powers not awakening. If you get the memory, Return of Calamity Ganon, you find out that Zelda's attempt to awaken her power at the Spring of Wisdom ended in failure.
Well, don't keep us in suspense. How'd everything go up there on the mountain?
So you didn't feel anything? No power at all?
I'm sorry, no.
This can spoil the suspense built in the memory to Mount Lanayru, in which Zelda has hope that the Spring of Wisdom will awaken her powers.
See that mountain? That's Mount Lanayru. It takes its name from the goddess of wisdom. Lanayru's decree is very specific. It says no one is allowed under the age of 17. For only the wise are permitted a place upon the mountain. I've prayed at the Spring of Courage and at the Spring of Power, yet neither awoke anything inside me. But maybe up there. Perhaps the Spring of Wisdom, the final of the three, will be the one. To be honest, I have no real reason to think that will be the case. But there's always the chance that the next moment will change everything. Tomorrow is my 17th birthday. So then I shall go and make my way up the mountain.
As a Zelda veteran, you'd think that that would be the spring to awaken her power since other incarnations of Zelda held the Triforce of Wisdom. Watching this memory first robs this moment of suspense of holding that Zelda will awaken her power there. And this all bleeds into the whole game too, because with the design of the open world game wanting to be this free, it affects the main quests as well. An example of this is the Divine Beast. Let's use Varuta as an example. When you get to Zora's Domain, you have two entrances to approach, and you even have unique cutscenes with Sidon. This is a clever way to keep the story structure intact while having the game's level of freedom.
Up top! Above you! Pardon the entrance, but you're a Hylian, aren't you? I was hoping perhaps you'd have a moment to talk. And who might you be? The Zora King is not accepting visitors at this time. I shall escort you out. Pardon my manners, but are you a Hylian? Why didn't you say so in the first place? Please, please, come in.
Once here, you encounter King of the Zoras, who is also Mipha's father. You meet up with them, and you encounter Mipha's teacher, Muzu, who despises Hylians because their plan to defeat Ganon ended up failing and leading to Mipha's demise. Sidon then reveals to Muzu that Mipha had feelings for Link, in which he denies that possibility. But then, Link wears the Zora tunic that Mipha made him and he sees that it's a perfect fit on him. Muzu then accepts Link's idea to stop the Divine Beast. He then tells Link to go fight a Lionel to get its shock arrows to damage the Divine Beasts enough to enter it. All this that I said, the story structure is once again strong, but it's the Lionel part where it loses some strength. Now this may not sound a big deal compared to the other story structure subjects I brought up, and honestly, it isn't, but still, I just wanted to bring this up. But the fight with the Lionel can be completely skipped. If you did a lot of exploring before coming here, then you likely have more than enough shock arrows to take down the Divine Beast. Now, probably the biggest example I could think of where the story structure completely falls apart is that you can go to the final boss right away once you beat the Great Plateau. As I've said before, this is a beautiful achievement in open world design, but the story structure becomes non-existent because you can basically skip the whole story by doing this. Now earlier I said the Great Plateau is where the story structure peaks. The reason I say this is because the level of freedom you have on the Great Plateau is perfect because it feels like a mini Hyrule and the story structure here is linear. And it's not because you can't go anywhere else, but it's because in order to progress the story, you had to fulfill objectives that the game wants you to do. And that means the story structure builds with the player and doesn't get cast aside completely, even if the player wants to. I'm not saying that the game needs to restrain you in order to function, but I do think that the game's story can be stronger if the story structure requires the player to fulfill objectives in a particular order, or if the story becomes a little more linear. And I think an amazing game that shows this beautifully is Red Dead Redemption 2. Red Dead Redemption 2 is another open world masterpiece with a beautifully told story and a strong story structure. It's the story of an outlaw named Arthur Morgan, our protagonist who runs with a gang run by Dutch Vanderlyn. I won't go into too much details on the story itself, but I will explain the story structure in details as I go through some of the story. The game opens with the gang reaching snowy mountains and trying to survive after a failed bank robbery. We arrive in an abandoned town where we temporarily settle. Our protagonist Arthur and our leader Dutch decide to search the area for supplies. We then head into quote-unquote gameplay, and what I mean by that is that many of the missions in this game tell you to do something, and if you try to do something else, then the game ends in a game over. We'll talk about this later. But the beginning of this game has what I like to call the Great Plateau tutorial. What this means is that the game restricts you from exploring the rest of the world until you finish certain parts first. And a bunch of these games that I'm going to bring up have this type of tutorial. Continuing on to Red Dead, at the beginning of the game it makes you complete 2 missions, one after another, both heavily story driven and heavily restrictive. In fact, all of the missions in this game are both of those things. After you complete both these missions, the game gives you a little bit of freedom, but not in terms of open world exploration, because if you try to leave the camp area, then the game kills your horse and then kills you as you try to get away. Instead, the freedom that you gain here is the ability to choose what mission you can choose next. From this info, you can see that we're still in the game's Great Plateau tutorial. Not long after you leave the snow area of the game sets you free. You're free to explore almost the entirety of the open world. You can even go to some areas that you and your gang don't get to until the end game. Going back through this game, I was genuinely surprised by how much freedom the game provides you when you're not doing a mission. While in this freedom, you can hunt animals, or go do some crazy shenanigans if you want to play without honor, or you can choose what missions are available to you, even side missions. However, once you decide to accept a mission, the level of freedom melts away. However, I will point out that just because the game gets restrictive at certain points doesn't mean that the story suffers. I think that the game restraining you during story sections and missions can help tell a stronger story. Even the side missions. Like, imagine if in a mission where you have to rescue a friend who's about to get handed off to bounty hunters, you just decide to go somewhere else just to go fishing or something. See what I mean? The restrictiveness has a purpose. It's not trying to take away the fun of the game from the player, it's trying to tell a rich story that we're here for. So how can Tears of the Kingdom follow this? Well, because we haven't seen direct gameplay like a Treehouse event for Tears of the Kingdom, I think it'll be easier to try to use Breath of the Wild to try to reconstruct it in the style of Red Dead Redemption 2's story structure. Now, I think the Great Plateau chapter of the game should remain untouched. As I've established earlier, that's where the structure is at its strongest. Let's use what happens right after the Great Plateau. King Rome tells Link to head to Kakariko Village, then gives us the paraglider. I think here the story should pause and go to free roam mode, where you can go anywhere you want at any time. Breath of the Wild already does this, and I think that should remain unchanged. What I would change, however, is the ability to do any story events at any time other than the ones you were given. So you can go to any of the main story villages, but you can't do any story events here. The game sort of does this in a few instances. For example, if you head to Death Mountain and don't talk to Bluto, the boss of the Gorons, Yunobo won't be in the mines where he is supposed to be trapped and then rescued, thus preventing you from continuing the story in Divine Beast Vah Rudania unless you talk to Bluto first. So in this theoretical version of Breath of the Wild, where the game is restraining you story-wise, like in Red Dead 2, you can head to Kakariko Village and then you meet Impa. The game plays a cutscene and gives you the info that we already get in the game, but then, this is where Breath of the Wild would borrow from Red Dead 2's story structure. When meeting Impa, you then activate a main story quest. While on this main story quest, the game should then activate what I'd like to call the Great Plateau effect. Let me explain. The Great Plateau effect is probably the best way to tell a story in an open world. To explain what the Great Plateau effect is, as I've said earlier, the Great Plateau at the beginning of the game restricts you from going anywhere outside the Great Plateau until you finish the story objectives here. However, while doing these objectives, the game gives you an insane level of freedom that Breath of the Wild is known for. So the so-called effect is when the game goes into a story section or mission and restricts you from going anywhere else in the world other than the area that the story quest wants you to tell its story in, while keeping the open world gameplay in check. Sort of like expansive open world levels. I think in this case, after accepting the quest from Impa, the game should restrain you from going anywhere other than Kakariko Village and a good chunk of the map around it and around the path to Hateno Village, so that way, if players want to climb or glide and still make their own path to Hateno Village, or even get to the Hateno Tower, they can. Or even if they want to take a linear path, they can take the main road there. I think Tears of the Kingdom can follow this theoretical version of Breath of the Wild's footsteps, especially since the game seems more story-focused than Breath of the Wild. In Breath of the Wild, the story loses some of what could have been with having the ability to choose any story event in any order you want. But if we want a strong, linear story with its level of freedom that we love from Breath of the Wild, then it should follow the footsteps that Red Dead Redemption 2 takes. I know it sounds like it would be horrible for Breath of the Wild, considering that the ability to go anywhere you want at any time is what the game is known for, but I'm just trying to come up with some ideas for Tears of the Kingdom, and I'm using Breath of the Wild as a demonstration for how these ideas could hypothetically be implemented in Tears of the Kingdom. And while I do think the game should restrict you from going anywhere you want while doing a story quest, I don't think that the game should restrict you on what you can do while on these missions on the same level that Red Dead does, where the game literally tells you what to do, but if you do something slightly different or take a different route, then it results in the game over. Yeah, I don't want Tears of the Kingdom to do that. When it comes to being restricted story-wise, but also still having a great level of freedom, I think we should look more into Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes and Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain.
Kept you waiting, huh?
Before I get into Metal Gear Solid 5, if you have motion sickness, I suggest you tread carefully as I talk about this game, because I'm going to show footage from these games, and it has a very shaky camera that can cause motion sickness. If you're sensitive with shaky cams and or have motion sickness, I suggest you put on headphones and look at something else while listening. I'll try to describe what I'm talking about as much as possible so you're not missing much. Metal Gear Solid 5 is another game where they turn an already established series into an open world title, and it surprisingly works here. In this game, you play as Big Boss, aka Snake, and tackle missions given to you that take place in multiple maps such as a black site, the Afghan desert, and the jungles of Africa. Yes, this whole package comes with 3 open world maps. Granted, one of these maps, Black Site, is small, but they somehow put off a great level of freedom. A lot of the ideas and story structure from Red Dead are also here in Metal Gear Solid 5, except for one important idea. Now, while I think Tears of the Kingdom should be inspired from Red Dead in many ways, as I listed earlier, it shouldn't restrict what you can do while on a story mission to the extent that it did in Red Dead. Let's talk about Ground Zeroes first. Ground Zeroes, while having its own short campaign, it serves more like a demo for the Phantom Pain. And it is the only game that I'm talking about that doesn't have the Great Plateau tutorial. You literally jump right into its open world, right as the cutscene ends at the beginning. This is the game that has the small map that I mentioned, Blacksite. This map is small compared to other open world titles, even Phantom Pains. But this game as a whole does the idea that I want Tears of the Kingdom to do with its story structure, whereas while you're doing story missions, you're restricted to go beyond the quest or mission area. However, this game isn't the greatest example of that either, because you can only do story missions in the story/mission area, which is the entire map. Plus, before and after you do a mission, it puts you back in the helicopter, which is this game's version of a level select. There's no free roam mode where you can just go anywhere you want and have fun and explore without doing any main story events. Well, technically you can still explore the whole map, since the entire map is available to you during these missions, but as I said earlier, the map is very small. There's no side objectives, you can only do story missions, making its open world a weak one to explore. Even the side missions here function the same way, but this game is supposed to be an introduction to the next game, so it gets a pass. And these problems, I believe, are fixed in the second Metal Gear Solid 5 game, I can't believe that's an actual sentence, Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain.
Why are we still here? Just to suffer. The body I've lost. The comrades I've lost. Won't stop hurting.
Unlike Ground Zeroes, this game has its own Great Plateau tutorial, where the first parts of the game are very restrictive, especially the first mission. The first mission takes place in a hospital. It takes place directly after Ground Zeroes. Snake wakes up in the hospital and has been told he's been in a coma for 9 years. Then the organization that tried to kill Snake in Ground Zeroes pinpointed Snake's location and the hospital is under attack. You're then guided by a mysterious figure named Ishmael out of the hospital. Ishmael is basically your tutorial guide. While escaping the hospital, you encounter a lot of hostages on your way out. Then, once we escape the hospital, Ishmael disappears. We then encounter Ocelot as we escape the hospital, a Metal Gear character who is a veteran to the series. The game then transcends back into gameplay and you have to run away and shoot the man on fire so he doesn't make direct contact with you to attack you. Once escaped, the game gives you a big story cutscene and a lot of context on what's currently going on and to inform players what happened in Ground Zeroes, in case you haven't played that game before. After this cutscene, you're finally dropped in the open world. But at this point in the game, you're still in the Great Plateau tutorial of this game, because the game sets some boundaries while doing a mission, and this goes beyond just this first mission. But while on these missions, you can still do anything you want and go anywhere within these boundaries. It's using the Great Plateau effect that I mentioned earlier, and it's using it right. Another thing that the game does right with its story structure with the freedom is that while it's restraining you from going anywhere else, some of the missions let you do the main objective right away. For example, the first mission of the game wants you to get an intel file that tells you specifically where your objective is. But if you want, you can get to your objective without getting the intel file, and the story remains unchanged and is still linear. The story structure is told in the mission structure similar to Red Dead's, in which the story progresses on which mission you choose from the ones available to you in the chapter you're on. And in Metal Gear's case, it's literally a mission select screen. And you know how I said earlier that you can go anywhere you want if you aren't doing a story mission? Well, that's literally an option in the menu. You can choose between doing a story mission or going to free roam mode in the menu. While this has an amazing story structure for the story it wants to tell, the story itself unfortunately is considered among the Metal Gear community to be the weakest of the series. And that is likely because of the troubled development history that I won't get into here. But I definitely think the way the story is told here is a beautiful way to do so for an open world title. When on any of the missions, with the exception of Mission 0 and Mission 46, you go into the Great Plateau effect, which is a strong way to tell a story in an open world environment. In terms of freedom in free roam mode, it's absolutely free and wherever you want to go at any time with very few exceptions. These exceptions being, you can't go to the final area of the game until you reach the end of the first chapter, and at one point in the story where the game wants you to reach a base to rescue someone, during this, the game wants you to encounter a boss fight that's on the way there. The restriction here is that an alternate route to the base is completely blocked off because the game wants you to encounter this boss fight. Even the fast travel points are disabled during this part of the game. But other than these restrictions, during free roam, you can truly go anywhere at any time after the first few missions. As I said before, the story itself is linear, and while on story missions, it restricts where you can go, but not what you can do. But what if the world restricts you on where you can go, but expands as the story progresses? Where basically the entire game is under the Great Plateau effect, but the effect area gets bigger and bigger as you progress. In that sense, we should look into Xenoblade Chronicles 3. For this part of the video, I will invite my good friend Professor Xenoblade, as he is the Xenoblade enthusiast.
Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has a different story structure to the other games that RJ's mentioned so far. It restricts you from exploring the entirety of the map in favor of telling a very rich story. It's a story that takes place in a world called Ionius. This world is in the middle of a war between two nations, Keves and Agnes. The reason these two sides fight is to live, since each side needs to harvest each other's life force to fuel a machine called the Flame Clock. These flame clocks are a source of life where if it runs out, the people associated will die. Kind of like if a candle burns for too long. So the more you kill, the more the flame clock fills up, the longer you get to live, which could be up to 10 terms or years at best. Terms are the equivalent of years in the Xenoblade 3 universe. Oh yeah, the people in this world can only live for 10 years, by the way. They are genetically born at a young age, usually around 10 years old, and as I've said, can only live up to a total of 10 years if they aren't killed in combat. Once they reach their 10th term, then they get the death ceremony called a homecoming. Pretty intense, right? And you're told all of this within the first hour of the game. In this story, we take the role of Noah from Keves, along with his two friends Uni and Lance. You're given an emergency mission to go and destroy a source of ether heading near your area. When we head there, we run into 3 soldiers from Agnes, Mio, which is my wife, Senna, and Tyon. We get into a fight, and we're very evenly matched, but then we get interrupted by an absolute legend that tells us that our way of living, killing to literally survive, and having only 10-year lifespans isn't the way to live. Crazy, I know. And he wants to give us a mission to end all of that. We then run into a mysterious being called Mobius, more commonly known as Wildride, and when we fight Wildride, it's a tough battle for all 6 characters. But then, Father Guernica activates the source of the ether that we came to destroy. The ether stone caused Noah and Mio to fuse into one powerful being called Ouroboros. The actual act of fusing is called interlinking and is nothing like how Dragon Ball does it. It's thanks to this transformation that we are able to defeat Mobius. However, he makes it so that the world sees all 6 as enemies to their own sides. So Team Agnes and Team Keves all end up working together even if they don't fully trust each other at first. Now you can say all of this was Xenoblade's Great Plateau tutorial, but the game never really leaves this structure. While this open world map is huge, it restricts you on where you're able to go because the story hasn't got to a certain point yet. For example, here as you can see on the screen right now, near the beginning of the game, you have to complete a specific quest and hit certain story flags before opening a new area to progress both story and the open world. The game will not let you progress through the world until you finish the main objective. I even checked to see if you can bypass this if you disable the main quest, however, that doesn't work either. That being said, this restriction is hardly noticeable anyway because the story takes you to the next new explorable area anyway, naturally. This type of structure works for this game because it's not trying to be this mega-scale open world game where you can go anywhere you want at any time, but rather the type of open world where the current areas in the chapter you're in are expansive and promote exploration while unintrusively keeping a main objective at all times. I'm sure it goes without saying, but Breath of the Wild would be an entirely different game if it had a similar story structure as Xenoblade Chronicles 3. This structure works for the Xenoblade series, but not for Breath of the Wild, and certainly not for Tears of the Kingdom if it's going to be anywhere as near as open as Breath of the Wild was. There are 2 games that come to mind that have a very similar structure, if not almost identical to Breath of the Wild's, and that Tears of the Kingdom can follow and take inspiration from these games' concepts of the Great Plateau effect and implement it quite well. One of these games is another Xenoblade title, Xenoblade Chronicles X.
We call this planet Mira. You won't find it on any star chart. But it's our new home.
Xenoblade Chronicles X is a very unique title for the topics we're discussing today, simply because I have always seen this game as Breath of the Wild's blueprints. Let me explain why. This game starts with our main silent protagonist waking up from a coma. Our character, Cross, doesn't remember anything from what happened before they woke up. Cross is woken up by a character named Elma, who is RJ's wife, who guides us through the basics and later helps us throughout the entire game. After what is basically the mini tutorial, the game lets you explore the first main continents of the game, but not beyond the sea to the final continents. The game prevents you from exploring the entire map, but only during these first few chapters. Think of these first few chapters as this game's version of the Great Plateau tutorial and effect combined. Even during the tutorial, the game's map is so unbelievably massive that it doesn't even feel like it's really restraining you. Think the actual Great Plateau, but 20 times larger. Oh yeah, that's the thing about this game, it is absolutely massive. Like, oh my goodness. And it runs on the Wii U. Seriously, mad props to Monolith Soft. And the level of freedom in this game is almost as free as Breath of the Wild's, in that where you can go anywhere you want at any time after leaving the tutorial stage of the game, it cuts you loose, even during the main story quests. But there is one key difference between these games, and that would be the story structure's restrictions. In Xenoblade Chronicles X, when you accept a story quest, or even just any side quest, you cannot do any other quest in the game until you've finished all of your current quests. You can still go anywhere you want, but you can only take on one quest at a time. Tears of the Kingdom could do something similar to this. As suggested earlier, the game could restrict you where you could go and accept a quest, but taking inspiration from Xenoblade X, you can go anywhere you want, but not do any other quests until you've finished your current one. Now this sounds like it would be a lot of tedious work to some, especially since Breath of the Wild's freedom is kind of just doing anything you want at any time, and it adds another level of freedom. But allow me to make a suggestion. I think if Tears of the Kingdom were able to do this, it should certainly only allow one story quest and all side quests available at the time simultaneously. That way, it keeps the story on rails, but you can't skip it either way, while still being able to roam around and do as many side quests as you like. Now, I said earlier that Xenoblade X was Breath of the Wild's blueprint. Another key reason for that is the team behind the development of Xenoblade X, Monolith Soft, also helped the development of Breath of the Wild. If they were to return again for Tears of the Kingdom, I think it would be really cool to see more ideas from X implemented. And while Xenoblade Chronicles X was Breath of the Wild's blueprints, Breath of the Wild itself actually feels like Elden Ring's blueprint.
Elden Ring, at the time of writing this, is the new Breath of the Wild. And what I mean by that is that around the time when Breath of the Wild came out, pretty much every open world game was then compared to it. With the release of Elden Ring, now every open world game is being compared to Elden Ring. There's even a lot of discussion in which game handled their open worlds better. Maybe I'll make a video of my thoughts on that in the future. Elden Ring barely has a Great Plateau tutorial. What I mean by that is that it does have a restrictive prologue, but it is very, very short. The game begins, and you basically have to either die to the first boss, or die to a cliff. That's it. After you die, the game then gives you the freedom to explore wherever you want, whenever you want, in the areas it allows you to. The way it works in Elden Ring is that the game's final main areas are unavailable to you until you beat 2 main story bosses. that may sound restrictive already, but here's the thing with Elden Ring. The map is so massive and open, even the areas that are available to you from the beginning have so much content that these areas could honestly be their own separate games. If you haven't played Elden Ring, that may sound like a huge exaggeration, but believe me, it's not. Elden Ring is so big that it still shocks me that this is all in one package. And even though Breath of the Wild is my favorite game, I admit that Elden Ring makes Breath of the Wild feel small in terms of the size of their maps. And they aren't just huge, they also have a lot of content to go through in these beginning areas, as well as the late game areas too. The things to do in this game is why people discuss Breath of the Wild and Elden Ring and how they handle their open worlds. In Elden Ring's world, there are a lot of items to find, weapons to collect, quests to do, bosses to fight, puzzles to solve, shrine-like catacombs, and dungeons. All of this sound familiar? Even though the final areas of the game are locked at the beginning, there is so much to do, where I actually put 115 hours into the game before I even got to the final areas of the game. I know gameplay time varies for each individual player, but for someone like me who loves exploring an open world, this is huge. You see, the world is so big that there's so much you can do where the game doesn't feel like it's restraining you at all unless you really try to skip everything to see how fast you can get through the game. There's a reason I've been focused on the non-restrictive feeling of this game and not really mentioning the story structure. The restrictedness of this game is key to its story structure. You're told early in the game that you want to mend the Elden Ring, so you need the shards, or runes, of the Elden Ring in order to do that. The game restricts you from heading to the final areas by telling you that you need more Great Runes, which are held by the main bosses of the game. You can fight any of the shard bearers that are available to you, and you only need 2. It's the game's way of giving you an objective, but not telling you that you have to do it all at the moment. Kinda like Breath of the Wild, where you need the 4 Spirit Orbs on the Great Plateau, but you are free to mess around if you want. So how can Tears of the Kingdom exactly take inspiration from Elden Ring? Well, I think that this game handles the Great Plateau effect in the way I want Tears of the Kingdom to, where the mission areas are huge and free, but make sense with the story. Let's come up with an example for Tears of the Kingdom. Let's say at the beginning of Tears of the Kingdom, you're restricted from going to the sky, but you still have the massive world of Hyrule on the surface. And let's provide a hypothetical context for this scenario. Let's say that Ganondorf is at risk of being revived, so you need to do an objective to stop that from happening. Let's use the Master Sword for example. I know this doesn't make sense lore-wise, but I'm just providing a hypothetical situation for the point I'm trying to make. Let's say the Master Sword needs blessings from the dragons of this world, so our objective is to find these dragons. We can go anywhere we want, but the sky. Basically the whole surface is using the Great Plateau effect, or it could even be the Great Plateau tutorial of this game. This can be this game's version of Elden Ring's starting areas. So once you get the Dragon Blessed Master Sword, you go to Ganondorf, but everything goes wrong, and then the rest of the game, aka the sky, is unlocked to you, possibly due to Ganondorf bringing these islands up to the sky. The sky can be this game's version of Elden Ring's late game areas. Now keep in mind, when I say late game, it doesn't mean that the sky will be the last place to go to in this hypothetical situation, it's just that this hypothetical game's way of unlocking the rest of the world. It can even happen pretty early, like on the Great Plateau in Breath of the Wild. So while our objective in Elden Ring is to unlock the rest of the world and progress its story is to beat 2 main bosses, Tears of the Kingdom can do that in a sense with its world. Keep the game huge enough where the open world can still feel free, while also having a bit of restriction so that the story can stay intact. I went on for a while here because this game has a lot of similarities to Breath of the Wild, making it one of the perfect blueprints for Tears of the Kingdom. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom seems to be a lot more story focused than Breath of the Wild, and if that is the case, then I think taking inspiration from some of these games could be a great step in the right direction. But like I said near the beginning of the video, if the game does none of these ideas, I'm sure it will still be a masterpiece. It is a Zelda game after all. I would like to thank my friend the Blade Tactician, also known as the Xenoblade Professor, for joining me on today's video, and a great thanks to my fellow viewers for watching. If you have any ideas yourself on what Tears of the Kingdom can do for its story structure and restrictive freedom, or even some other games I can learn from, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Please stay tuned. Only a few more months away until the release of Tears of the Kingdom. I cannot wait.